Lovely to be back up here. Lovely to be here when we're ending Daniel. It's been a wonderful book. I've really enjoyed going through it, and I hope you have too. So we're at Daniel chapter 12, which is the last chapter. Well, it's kind of the last chapter. Just a random sort of fact. Do you know there's actually a couple of other chapters to Daniel? Chapter 13 and chapter 14. You won't find them in your Bible, though. They're only found in the Apocrypha. And if you're interested in reading, chapter 13 is called Susanna, and chapter 14 is called Bel and the Dragon. And they both contain different stories about Daniel. Susanna is an interesting one, Bel and Dragon is an interesting one. A few lions come up in it again, so some really interesting stories. If you do want to read them, I reckon go Bible Gateway, and if you select the Catholic version of the NIV Bible, you'll be able to read them. They're not very long, but quite an interesting read. But in our Bible, in the Protestant Bibles, we end at chapter 12, and it's a fitting end to the book of Daniel, talking about the last days. What do you think it will be like at the end of time in the last days? This one was from Independence Day, the movie. I think it was about 2007. So aliens coming in. Is that your view of the last days? Maybe you think the last days there's going to be lots of natural disasters, earthquakes, landslides, that type of thing. Maybe that's your view of the last days. Perhaps you've got a nicer one than that. Maybe you've got Jesus coming on the clouds and you're just looking forward to that day of his second coming. Or perhaps for you, you're thinking in terms of Revelation, which we're going to do shortly, and you're thinking about the city of God and maybe the roads paved with gold. Maybe we can call this the city of gold or something like that. Maybe that's your view of the last days. Well, in Daniel chapter 12 today, we're going to try and unpack what do the last days look like? What does it mean? A couple of things we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the distress that comes in the last days. That won't be fun, will it? Thankfully, we'll also talk about the deliverance that comes in the last days. And we'll talk about a bit of a phrase that occurred in Daniel chapter 12 where it talks about people going sort of to and fro. So there's this searching that's happening in the last days. But I want to start with this question. For how long will the end of days last? We sort of noticed when we read through there was a few different phrases which sort of help us unpack how long these last days will last. It says, I'll start from verse 5. I'll jump back to verse 1, don't worry. But verse 5 says this. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two others, one on this bank of the river, and one on the opposite bank. One of them said to the man clothed in linen. By the way, if someone's clothed in linen, it often refers to a priest. We've already met this person, I think in chapter 10 it was. We met this priest. And then there's these two that are standing on the banks of the river. We don't really know who these people are. Possibly angels, possibly Michael and Gabriel. Probably unlikely, but we're not exactly sure who they are. And one of them said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, "How long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled?" Now, the astonishing things that we're talking about are primarily what's been happening in chapter 11. In chapter 11, we've got Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes who's come in and he's desecrated the temple. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But how long is these terrible things that are happening going to go on for? And then verse 7, the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river lifted up his right hand. Lifting up a right hand is often taking an oath. He's lifted up his left hand too, and commentators couldn't really agree on why he's lifting up his left hand. Maybe it's sort of a double oath, or this oath is absolutely certain and true. So he's lifted up his right hand and his left hand towards heaven. And I heard him swear by the one who lives forever, saying, "It will be for a time, times, and half a time." Right, so we're all clear then, aren't we? We know exactly how long it will be. A time, times, and half a time. What on earth does that mean? Well, there's a few things it could mean, but it seems that a time is just a year. So if we've got a time, and then some translations will have 2 times, but we've got a time, 2 times, and half a time. If you add all of that up, it will be 3.5 years. Pretty easy? Right, so we don't have to worry about the rest. We know that there's a time coming, it will be 3.5 years, and then the end will come. No, it's not that easy. We'll come to that in a moment, but I'm just wondering, if you think of 3.5 years, do you think that's a long time? If you're younger in the congregation today, you're probably thinking 3.5 years is a very, very long time. If you're older in the congregation today, you're probably thinking 3.5 years is not very long at all. What about if I tell you that there's going to be great distress in those 3.5 years? Does that make it harder, possibly? If I was going to tell you that you're going to be sick for 3.5 years, that would be pretty hard to hear. I sort of wonder, if you knew events, how long events would take, does that make it easier? Let's say World War II. If they knew that it was going to go for 6 years, would that have made it easier? I don't know. I was speaking to my brother recently who had a hammer and he smashed his finger, and it's broken into it's got many cracks right throughout it. And he thought after 6 weeks that it was going to be healed. And then after 6 weeks, he had scans and it looked exactly the same as it did 6 weeks earlier. And so now he's told, well, it's probably going to be another 6 weeks. And he was saying, I was looking forward to the end. I knew it was going to be 6 weeks, and now I've got another 6 weeks. And if he knew it was 12 weeks at the start, would that have been easier or would that have been harder? It's hard to know. But 3.5 years, in the context here, is actually not saying it's going to be a long time. It's actually saying it's going to be a short time. Because in terms of eternity, 3.5 years is not very long at all, is it? So when we read this passage, this is actually encouragement for us that when difficult times come, when times of distress come, then be encouraged. Persevere through it. Don't think that this is too hard and I need to abandon my faith. No, persevere through it, because this time is such a short time, even when it feels like a long time at the time. This time is such a short time compared to all of eternity to come. So take courage in that. Persevere through that. You know, in Habakkuk it says, if it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. God's not sitting up there going, you know, there's going to be hard times. Yeah, one day I'll get around to it. He is waiting for exactly the right moment for the second coming, for Christ to come again and to put all things right. Why is there the delay at the moment? There's the delay because all the nations haven't heard the gospel yet. And we need to wait until all the nations hear the gospel until Christ comes again. Later in the chapter, we have 1,290 days. And if you add that up, that's about 3.5 years. Elsewhere, I think in chapter 8, we've got about 42 months. So all of these things are sort of saying, well, it's around 3.5 years. In Revelation, which we'll get to, we're starting that this year, aren't we? December 31, just this year. Right. We are starting Revelation this year. And I'm sure at some stage we'll get to chapter 12, and it's 1,260 days in chapter 12 there. So there's these numbers that add up to 3.5 years. It doesn't matter that the numbers don't align. One can be the lunar calendar and one can be the solar calendar, that type of thing. But it's around this period of time. But persevere, because if you do persevere in this time, then like Daniel in verse 13, it says, you shall rest and you shall stand in your allotted place at the end of time. You might remember in chapter 7, I talked about the book being opened, and is your name written in that book? If your name is written in that book because you have been faithful and you have persevered through these difficult times, then that's a wonderful thing to be rising again with Jesus. So what does it, that's the time, 3.5 years. I'll explain that a little bit more as we go. But what does it look like at the end of time? Well, we're going to go back to verse 1. And in verse 1 it says, at that time, there we go, At that time, Michael the great prince, now we've been introduced to Michael again in chapter 10. Back in chapter 10, he brought understanding of a vision. Michael is described as the great prince, but we understand him to be an archangel. And he's put in place here to protect your people. Now, why does he need to protect your people? Second sentence there will be a time of distress or a time of trouble, such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. So we need Michael here as a bit of a protection for this great distress that's coming. Now, this distress that's coming at the end of time, is it something that has already happened and we don't have to worry about it? It was 3.5 years, but that was 500 years ago. Or is it something that's happening now? Or is it something that's happened, is going to happen in the future? Well, if you read apocalyptic literature, and this is apocalyptic literature, if you read it correctly, we can't read it as we normally understand time. We normally understand time as fairly linear, don't we? We've got the past, the present, the future, and time continues on. When we read apocalyptic literature, it's almost like it sort of circles around. So we can have something that's happened in the past, and it can appear to be quite literal what's happening. But then we can have something that's occurring in the present, the same sort of understanding that's happening in this passage is something that's happening in the present time. Is there distress in these present times? Yeah, there is. And we can understand some distress that's going to be happening in the future. So apocalyptic literature, although particularly when we read chapter 11 and it's talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes and the abomination of desolation when he burst into the temple in 167 and desecrated it and set up worship to himself there, and the Jewish people have now lost their temple and there's nowhere to worship anymore. How long will this go on, Lord? We can understand it in that context, and that's fine. But what we cannot do with apocalyptic literature is confine it to that. It has application far beyond that. So even if that period of time was about 3 years, it doesn't mean that the period of time of great distress that we might be in now and a period of great distress that's going to come before Christ comes again, it doesn't mean that's contained to 3.5 years. And it doesn't mean that it won't occur because it already happened back in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. No, that's not the case at all. These things keep happening and it's sort of circular. It goes around and around again and again, and it kind of intensifies before Christ comes. How long will it be for? How long is the distress in our time? 3.5 years, but not a literal 3.5 years. It is 3.5 years in that it will only be a short time. It might seem like years and years, but in terms of eternity, this is only a short time. So, persevere in this time. Persevere because the end has not yet come. Persevere because although the days are difficult, they seem difficult, we know that eternity is there waiting for us when Christ comes again. What's it like in our current days? It's funny because people try and interpret sort of the Antichrist, don't they? And they might say that Hitler was the Antichrist. He might be a form of Antichrist, but he's not the Antichrist. There's Vladimir Putin. Where does he rate in all of this? What's happening with Hamas and Israel at the moment? One Israeli Major General said, mothers, fathers, babies, young families are killed in their beds, in the protection room, the dining room, in their garden. He said it's not war, it's not even a battlefield, it's a massacre. There is distress that's going on at the moment in our world. And from that perspective, we are living in the last days. From the perspective of the fact that Christ has already come, but he will come again, we're told in the New Testament that we are living in the last days. And in these last days, we expect distress to come. And in the future, we expect a distress to come that hasn't been seen before. And we need to understand, when we read this passage, we need to understand that this is expected. We don't look around at what's happening in the world and go, oh, God doesn't care, he obviously isn't in control. No, when we read Daniel chapter 12, it tells us that definitely God is knowing what's happening. He is in control of all things, but there's a reason that he has to wait. Peter read a little bit of Matthew 24 last week, and I want to read some of that. I haven't got it on the screen because it's reasonably long, so I'll be changing slides all the time, but just sit and listen to it. I'm going from 24 verse 3. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars." Yeah, that's in our time at the moment, isn't it? There are wars, rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Which is interesting. Peter paused on that too, didn't he? Like, Christ, don't be alarmed. Well, further on it actually says flee to the mountain. So it's sort of, you've got to take protection, but don't be alarmed. Why should you not be alarmed? Because God knows this is happening. God is still in control of all things. Don't be alarmed to the point that you have to give up your faith, because God has got all of this in control. The next verse says, such things must happen. Such things must happen. I'm going to go into that a bit further in a moment, but such things must happen. But the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, we see that, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines. Yes, there are famines in our days. There are earthquakes, yes, in various places. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. Don't be alarmed by any of it. Then it talks about us, and it says, you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. And you will be hated by all the nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. I'm hoping that's none of us here. That because of the persecutions that come, because of the distress that's in the world, we think, oh, it's too hard, and we turn away from the faith. Because you know what? It's only 3.5 years. That is nothing compared to all of eternity. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The gospel has to be preached to all nations, and then the end will come. And then it goes on to say, so when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, so that's from Daniel chapter 11, it says, spoken through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Well, what's the reader supposed to understand? What are they supposed to understand from that text? What are they supposed to understand from Daniel? Well, understand this, that there will be distress in the last day. Understand also that when we read Daniel, we're reading it knowing that there's a historical application to what's happening, there's a present application, and there's a future application, that this time of distress will come, but it will only be for a short time. And then after that comes the resurrection. What will it be like at the end of time? There will be distress. But there will be deliverance. It says this, but at that time your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. I don't think there's anywhere in the Old Testament where the resurrection or the double resurrection, the rising of those to everlasting life and the rising of those to everlasting shame and contempt, is this clear. I don't know what you think about, if you've thought much about those who aren't saved and where they go. Sometimes I sort of start thinking about the logic of it and thinking, can hell actually exist? Because if God isn't there and God is the source of all life, then how can it exist? But that's not how the Bible treats it. The Bible treats it as people will be raised to everlasting shame and everlasting contempt. It's a scary feeling. It's a scary type of idea, isn't it? And so this passage reminds us to stay steadfast, to keep persevering, because we don't want to end up where God isn't. Hell is where God isn't. We don't want to end up there. We want to be with the one who created life. We want to be with the one who loves us. And we want to be there, and it will be an everlasting there. And so the momentary time of distress that we experience in our life is nothing compared to all of eternity. So I've talked about this great distress, and now there's this deliverance that's coming. What is really interesting is the phrase that was used about sort of the birth pains. And the birth pains sort of meaning there's great pain and distress, but out of that a child is born. And if we start to think about life generally, there's often hardships that give birth to great things, aren't there? There's great suffering and injustice that happens in the world, but often they then are the catalyst for something amazing happening, social change. A great example of that would obviously be someone like William Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery. There was great pain and distress to him personally, but obviously what was happening at the time. But out of that came a wonderful thing. Character in our life, good character, is often bred through difficult circumstances. Compassion and empathy often come through suffering. Love often grows stronger through common suffering. I don't know what you imagine for people that you love, for perhaps your children. Do you want them to have a really easy life? And I suspect if you're honest, you'd probably say no, because if they just had an easy life, they actually wouldn't develop good character. And you can probably think of people who have had really easy lives and they haven't actually developed good character. For whatever reason, God in his wisdom has seen it fit that through suffering we will be delivered. I don't like it like that. None of us likes it like that. But God in his wisdom has seen that these Antiochus-type moments or distress moments are ones that actually bring us back to him and actually produce something that is quite wonderful, that is beyond all the distress of these 3.5 years. In Jeremiah it says, "How awful that day will be. No other will be like it. It will be a time of trouble for Jacob," which is Israel. But it says this, "But he will be saved out of it." It doesn't say he'll be saved from it. As a Christian, you won't be saved from the distress that comes our way in the world, but out of it you will be saved. In Matthew, we read before that such things must happen. Such things must happen. Since the fall, God has deemed it necessary for the world to suffer. And he's deemed it necessary so that his ultimate purpose of salvation might be fulfilled. There is something that is far greater and more wonderful than the suffering that we endure. You know, Israel were chosen as a nation to suffer, and they were chosen to suffer so that they might go out and bear fruit, and they might actually tell of God's name to the nations. They constantly failed in it, but there was one who was faithful, the true Israel, and that's Jesus Christ. And ultimately what happened to him? He suffered. He was in distress. He died on the cross, and out of that death we are brought into resurrection life. Out of suffering, out of distress comes marvelous things. What does the end of time look like? Well, it looks like distress. It looks like suffering. But be assured that through that distress and through that suffering, God's plans of redemption are being accomplished. What will the end of time look like? There will be distress, but there will be deliverance. I mentioned also that many will be searching. Many will be searching. Probably the second sentence there. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. I'm just going to go back to the start though. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. When I read that first, I thought it kind of meant seal it away so that no one really looks at it. But when you read it in the context of this passage, it's actually saying quite the opposite of that. It's saying, make sure that you preserve what's being said here, because this isn't just for this time of Antiochus, or this isn't just for the time of the future. This is for all time so that people can read this. The words that are written in Daniel chapter 12 are for every generation to read, that there will be distress that comes, but through that distress comes deliverance. And we find out that during these last days, at the end of time, people will go to and fro. The idea that I get here, it doesn't say to and fro there, does it? In the ESV, it must say to and fro. It says here and there. I get the idea that people are just sort of scurrying about. They're putting their effort into going one way, maybe getting knowledge in one way, and then they're really not sure and they turn the other way. They're without a radar, aren't they? They don't know which direction that they're heading. Last Sunday, Brianna and I were in Stirling, and there was a large fire in a supermarket that we happened to be in Stirling. And at the time, there wasn't much smoke. There was just a lot of fire in the supermarket. Once we got out, it wasn't that long afterwards that you really couldn't see anything in the streets of Stirling. There was so much smoke everywhere, we weren't able to get back to the car for some time. And when there's smoke, you sort of think, well, people are blinded. People weren't going crazy, thankfully. They weren't scurrying about going to and fro. But it could have been like that because people just lose their radar, lose their direction. What's happening in this passage isn't people being physically blinded and not able to see where they're going and scurrying about, but spiritually they are blinded and they're not hearing the word of God. Is that happening in our time? Absolutely. Are people scurrying about and not sure which direction to turn? Absolutely. Are people increasing in knowledge in our time? They are. But they actually don't have the wisdom to interpret that knowledge and understand what that means for the world and the end of the world. And that's what this passage is telling us. This passage also sort of, with the to and fro, it actually refers back to something that happened in Amos. Amos is an earlier time, and it says, a famine of hearing the voice of the Lord will be there. A famine of hearing the voice of the Lord. They shall run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, but they shall not find it. Why don't they find it? They don't find it because they're searching in all the wrong places. Something was written about the Hellenistic period, which is the Greek period around Alexander the Great, around Antiochus. And it was characterized by these things. Secularization, so the decrease in religion, I guess, is characterized by materialism. You start to read this list and go, yeah, that's pretty much like us. Economic activity, yep. Exploitation, yep. Militarization, yep. So they were living in a time that was similar to us. They were putting all this time and energy in different things, scurrying around doing things, but they actually had spiritual blindness. They didn't really understand what was happening. They were going to and fro. And there's many different ways that we can go to and fro and try and seek fulfillment in different things, and they become an idol to us. And we stop hearing the word of the Lord when we're going to and fro. It could be for us sensuality or sexual immorality. See, if our goal is bodily pleasure, we don't hear the voice of the Lord. We'll be running around trying to satisfy hunger and thirst in unholy ways. For us, it might be just busyness of life. There are some people whose busyness is actually to avoid thinking about anything. And they're just trying to keep themselves busy. And they're gaining knowledge and all of that. They're running around, scurrying around, going to and fro. They're gaining knowledge, but they're not actually understanding what's happening. Knowledge increases. People will do important things, but although they know, they don't actually understand. Some people are just too busy to think about their relationship with God. And I guess this passage this morning gets us to ask ourselves, do we just know things, or do we understand the sign of the times? Many will go to and fro. Many will know, but they don't understand. They will not understand how to interpret these last days. And because they don't understand, what don't they do? They don't wait. They don't persevere. They don't know that the 1,290 days or 3.5 years or 42 months or however long it ends up being, they don't know that that is only for a time, and they give up. They don't persevere. They get caught up with whatever's happening in the world at the time. They follow the prevailing winds. They put their sail up and they're just happy to go with wherever the wind takes them. But the problem is the end will come. And the 3.5 years will be up, and they've been taken away, and they won't be left there standing with Daniel on the last day. I don't want you to be too comfortable this morning thinking that that's not you, because trouble in this world will come. We are living in the last days. Even if the last day was back at 167 BC, it still is now, and it still will be in the future if we understand apocalyptic literature correctly. Maybe you know that in those 3.5 years, you're not able to take the hard road. You're just going to give in to the sail that's up and go with the wind, and you won't endure it unto death. If that's you, know this morning that you can be strengthened. How can you be strengthened? The only way that you can be strengthened is through Christ. The only way that you can be strengthened is turning to His Word. Do everything you can today to be strengthened, to be fed upon His Word, to be nourished by His Word. Because you too, like Daniel, can overcome the distress of the present situation in these last days. And you too, like Daniel, can rest. It says in verse 13, which means die, but you can rest, you can die, knowing that you will be resurrected on the last day, knowing that you will again stand when Christ rise again, and you will be in your allotted place at the end of the days because your name is written in the book of life. Perhaps you don't yet know your need for this. Perhaps you keep getting caught up in the winds and the flavour of the month, whichever way the wind is blowing. Then repent this morning. Turn back to Christ, feed on His Word, and stand at the end of time, for the 3.5 years are coming to an end. So what does it look like, the end of time? It looks like a time of distress like we've never known before. But it looks like deliverance for the people of God. They will be delivered through these last days. There will be a time of searching. Many people are going to and fro, gathering up great knowledge, but they won't understand the sign of the times. At the end of time, there will be great distress, one that has never been seen before, but through this distress, you shall be saved for the resurrection of life. As it's the last chapter in Daniel, just very quickly in summing up Daniel, we gave the title Trial and Triumph, didn't we? Trial and Triumph. Hopefully today you've seen the distress is the trial and the resurrection is the triumph. Hopefully throughout the rest of the book we've seen this occurring as well. You might remember that the book was divided into 2 sections. The first section being lots of different dreams of people like Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel was able to interpret those dreams. And we learnt through that, with the dreams and the rising and the falling of the kingdoms, what did we learn? That God is in control of all of this. It doesn't shock him. He's the one that causes the rising and falling. God is in control of all of these different things. We saw the fiery furnace, we saw the lion's den, we saw the faithfulness of people like Daniel in the midst of difficult or distressing circumstances. And we saw that God is faithful to us in all of that. When I was up here last, we were talking about the four beasts coming from all different directions, nations rising up. Yes, we can interpret it for the time back then, but we can interpret it for now. We can interpret it for the future in this apocalyptic literature. But we saw there the Son of Man and the everlasting kingdom, and to put our faith in that, in the Son of Man. We've seen a ram and a goat, and we've seen that different leaders will rise up. But amidst the persecution, we're reminded, often by angels in these stories, that these things will not last. There is something much greater that's coming. See, even with the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, it is only 3.5 years. The time will come to an end, and the resurrection of the Son of Man and the sons of man will take place. Hopefully, through the book of Daniel, we have seen the foretelling of the Son of Man, the Messiah who is to come into the world, who has come into this world, but who is to come again in this world at his second coming. In him and through him and through his suffering, we see the universal reign of God in history and beyond history. So there is triumph in the trial. Our God reigns. Let us pray.